We're looking at what Republican voters are saying in a new NewsNation Decision Desk HQ poll ahead of Wednesday's GOP debate, airing right here on NewsNation. 29% of Republican voters say they would support disqualifying President Donald Trump from the ballot if he's convicted in his criminal cases, joining 85% of Democrats in saying the same thing. Let's bring in Chris Hahn, former senior advisor to Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, and Mick Mulvaney, former acting White House chief of staff for President Trump. Both are NewsNation political analysts. A big week ahead for all of us here, especially the two of you. Thanks for being here this morning. Mick, let me start with you here. As mentioned at the top, some of these GOP voters saying they'd support disqualifying the former president if he's convicted. Looking at these numbers and breaking it all down, Mick, did it surprise you that that number sits at nearly 30%?
No, it doesn't, Markie, surprise me. What I think folks are overlooking is that it's not really going to make that much difference. Even if Donald Trump were to lose a third of his support, he'd still be very competitive, around 45% in the polling, which means that some other candidate would have to consolidate all of the other votes in order to beat him. But more importantly, the calendar. The trial in New York doesn't start, I think, until March. The trial in Georgia doesn't start until August. The primary will be effectively over by the end of March. Donald Trump should have enough delegates to become the Republican nominee by the end of March. And if that happens, it doesn't really make any difference what happens in those criminal proceedings afterwards, because he will be the nominee. And I got news for you. Once he gets that, he's not giving it back. So it's an interesting insight, I think, into the electorate, but I don't think it changes the outcome.
Yeah, he's not going away once he clinches that. And there's hundreds of witnesses, millions of pages of documents to go through. You make a good point about the calendar year. Chris, given the level of support that President Trump has, even despite all of his legal troubles, does it really matter?
Well, I don't think it matters in the primary. But if those 29% still don't like the fact that he's convicted in November, which really matters, then it's going to matter a whole lot in the general election, because, quite frankly, he can't afford to lose any Republican support in November of 2024. And if he loses upward of 30% of it, he cannot be elected. I think if he loses 10% of it, he can't be elected. So that's important. And yeah, no, I don't believe he'd give back the nomination if he's convicted. I don't think he'd give back the presidency if he's elected president and his term expires. So I think that we've got to be very careful with this man. And I think the American people need to take him very, very seriously. I think the Republicans running against him need to start, and I think Nikki Haley has started, calling him the chaos candidate, and I think President Biden needs to start attacking him as well.
And speaking of President Biden, Chris, just a quick follow-up question for you, because the other areas of this new polling, when it comes to Biden's approval rating, 58% of respondents strongly or somewhat disapprove of his performance thus far. Only 13% approve of how he's handled the Israel-Hamas war. What kind of uphill battle do Democrats have ahead of him here?
Well, you know, look, Joe Biden is not going to be the most popular guy in a Republican Party primary poll, but he does have an uphill battle.
And that was respondents overall. Yeah,
his numbers are flagging across the board, across the country. I think a lot of it has to do with people thinking he is too old to be president of the United States. I think that opinion bleeds into every number, every question asked about Joe Biden. And I think it's a significant problem that he needs to address, or, you know, Democrats have to consider going another way.
Yeah. The poll also finds that President Trump remains, you know, as we all know, far ahead of his other Republican rivals. But it also found that Governor Ron DeSantis is in the lead when it comes to who voters would choose as their second choice if their first, being Donald Trump, is disqualified. Mick, does this go against the notion that Nikki Haley is the one gaining momentum here, as we've talked about a lot as of late?
Yeah, a little bit. On this first ballot, it looks like Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis are pretty much tied, but Ron DeSantis is pulling about 35%, or 3 times as many folks as the preferred second candidate. In fact, Vivek Ramaswamy is doing better in our poll on the preferred second candidate. I do think it shows a little bit of weakness for Nikki Haley. Also shows a divide in the party. I think what you're seeing there are Trump voters who would move to DeSantis, DeSantis voters who would vote to Trump, et cetera. I think this speaks to the divide between the traditional wing of the party, the neoconservative, conservative establishment wing of the party on one hand, and the Trump populist wing on the other. It may be, Markie, it may be that there are not enough non-populist voters out there for Nikki Haley to catch Donald Trump at all, and that may be what you're seeing in those preferred seconds.
Thank you for watching. Go to newsnationnow.com to find News Nation on your television provider. And don't forget to click the red subscribe button below to get more of News Nation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.